Hi, we're back again today to discuss the doctrine of the church. And today we want to look at the era of the patristics, the era of the church fathers. This was a period that lasted from the close of the New Testament right on up through about the first 500 to 600 years of Christianity. And what we want to do today is discuss how the doctrine of the church and how that understanding developed over that period of time. And that's going to be the subject of our first video here in this little short subsection of ecclesiology. In the patristic era, the way that the church was seen, the way they saw themselves rather, was a people that were in the world but not of it. They saw themselves as pilgrims and strangers in the earth, people whose home was here, but their ultimate home was not. So that was the general mentality of those who lived then, that idea of the wandering pilgrim. One of the things that's really interesting about the second century church, now this is about 100 years after the close of the New Testament, but of the second century church is their discipleship process. And that discipleship process is known as the catechumenate. Catechumenate. The disciples were called the catechumens. And they went through an intense period of discipleship that lasted anywhere from 1 to 3 years. And during this time, they were instructed in all the faith and morals of Christianity, and they were prepared for baptism. Now, baptism was their induction into the church, as well as an act that sealed their salvation. We don't always treat baptism that way today, but that's the way they saw it in the second century. And once that trial period was over, once their discipleship period ended, they would then submit to baptism. And then once they were baptized, they were full members of the church. They could partake of the Lord's table, and they could do anything else that was a full benefit to being a Christian. One of the interesting things about the catechumenate, though, was a lot of people died during the catechumenate process. They died while they were still catechumens. And if that occurred, oh well. I guess they never were meant to be saved. That sounds really harsh, and I shouldn't laugh about that, but it's just interesting that that's the way that they approached it. Contrast that with what you already know about the book of Acts, where whenever someone would profess faith, they would be baptized really as quickly as possible. The Ethiopian eunuch stopped the chariot to be baptized, and the Philippians jailer's family was baptized. And so baptism occurred rather quickly in the first century, but seemed to be delayed for quite a while in the second century, only about 100 years later. Now, why is that? Well, I think one of the main reasons that they delayed baptism was on account of persecution. The Christians of the second century were under intense persecution, this time from the Romans, and they were afraid that they couldn't trust someone who would not be fully vested in the faith. Someone could be converted quickly, be baptized, and all of a sudden prove to be unfaithful when the time of testing came. So I believe it was because of these persecutions that the period of being a catechumen was so long. Now, while we're discussing Roman persecution, that's important for the doctrine of the church. And Roman persecutions usually occurred for 3 reasons. Number one, and by the way, I just want to insert, we know this from the apologetic work of Justin Martyr. We understand the catechumen process because of Justin Martyr as well. He was a second century apologist. Roman persecutions usually occurred for 3 reasons. Number one, Christians were accused of being atheists. Now, isn't that interesting, that a Christian would be accused of being an atheist? Today, we think of an atheist as someone who just doesn't believe in God, period. But then, they did not worship the gods of Rome. Atheism was denying the Roman pantheon. And so Christians were accused of being atheistic. Christians, instead of worshiping the known pagan gods of Rome, instead worshiped the unknown God. When emperor worship was all the rage, they refused to worship the emperor. And that was a sore spot with some of the emperors. Some of them weren't, I guess you could say, didn't care that much whether or not they were worshipped and all. But some of them really thought that their godhood was very important, and they needed to be worshipped, and they needed to be worshipped by everybody. Of course, Jews wouldn't do it, and of course, Christians wouldn't do it. So therefore, that's why they were persecuted so much. But Christians, believe it or not, were accused of being atheistic. Second, Christians were accused of cannibalism. That's unbelievable. But they were, because they ate the flesh and drank the blood of their God. Because again, at the Last Supper, which becomes the Lord's Supper, Jesus said, "This is my flesh, or this is my body, drink, and this is my blood." So Christians were accused of being cannibals, because they ate the flesh and drank the blood of their God. The Romans didn't care to understand the nuance of what the Christians were doing. They just went on the surface of the words that were spoken and said they're cannibals. Christians were also accused of being incestuous. They were accused of loving their brothers. And you can imagine what the Romans thought of that in their sexually obsessed pagan culture. Sounds like the 21st century America. But anyway, that's why it would be good to read Justin Martyr to help Christian apologetics today. But I digress. They loved their brothers and sisters. And to the Roman, love and their understanding was sexual love. And that's the only thing they understood it to be. So if you love your brother, that means you're sleeping with your brother. They could not comprehend that Christian love was somewhat different. In general, the Christians upset the moral and social order of the time. Now, isn't that interesting, with all of the contemporary social issues being bandied about? And to be quite honest, Christians are losing in the court of public opinion on these. But it's no different than the 2nd century. Christians upset the general moral and social order of the Roman Empire. I find it interesting that Christians now, like the ancient Romans then, get very upset at those groups who did not defy the existing social order. I just think that now the shoe tends to be a little bit on the other foot. We Christians believe that we're in the driver's seat of the social order, and it is the pagans of today that are upsetting our social order. Maybe the roles are reversed. Maybe I ought to think on that for a little bit. But anyway, Christians were accused of 3 things: being atheistic, being cannibals, and being incestuous. And much of Justin Martyr's apologies are to combat these false charges. Another majorly important idea of the doctrine of the church in the early Christian era, when we're talking within a couple generations of the apostles, is the primacy of the bishop. The bishop became front and center within a couple generations after the apostles. We see very little about bishops in the New Testament. Bishop, presbyter, overseer, those words are the same, but we don't see the hierarchical structure in the New Testament that becomes quickly evident in a much more Gentile church. Remember, all of the authors of the New Testament were either Jewish or very sympathetic to Jewishness. But by the time we get a generation or two away, the church becomes very Gentile. And it takes on a much more Gentile flavor than its original Jewish roots. The importance of the bishop is first stated by Ignatius of Antioch, who lived 1 generation after the apostles. He's the very next generation. In the late 1st century, he said that the bishop should be followed as Christ is followed. So the bishop just sits in this primary position. The bishops relied on something very important upon which they based their authority, and that's the idea of apostolic succession, which is the process by which the apostles appointed their successors, who became bishops, and then the bishops then appointed their successors, and so on down the line, to keep the teaching pure and to keep unsound doctrine out. So that idea of apostolic succession, where the apostle appoints a bishop, who then appoints a bishop, who then appoints a bishop, who then appoints a bishop, and so on, so that everyone who is a genuine bishop of the Christian church could then trace back that cycle of appointments all the way back to an apostle. And they felt that by doing that, they could keep the teaching pure, because they could prove that there was an unbroken line of succession that goes all the way back to one of the original apostles. And that idea of apostolic succession was a very important tool in the early church to help combat heresy and to help establish who really was the proper authority of the Christian movement. The bishops then possessed the oral teaching known as tradition, capital T tradition, or sometimes called tradition 1, of the apostles, which were the keys of interpreting the Old Testament and the rapidly spreading New Testament scriptures. This oral teaching was the hermeneutical method. It was the proper mode of interpretation for the early church, and to interpret the Old Testament as well as the brand New Testament. Now, the documents of the New Testament weren't new. They were all written in the 1st century, but they were being spread rapidly throughout the growing church population around the Mediterranean. Now, why did they utilize this method of apostolic succession? Why was that important? First of all, the New Testament had been written, but not fully spread throughout the churches at this time. So there was no universally established written record of the teachings of the apostles. There were fragments. Some people had them, some people didn't. It wasn't universal. So the apostolic succession then became a way of preserving what would eventually be circulated in Scripture, even though it wasn't fully circulated yet. Number 2, it was to preserve the apostolic teaching against counterfeits. And even in the book of Acts, there are several counterfeits. You could think of Simon the magician, or a handful of other people who were counterfeiting the gospel message. The idea of succession became the best method of preserving true teaching, because if someone was confronted as being a counterfeit, the words to them were, "What's your succession? Who appointed you, and to which apostle do you trace this appointment?" And if there was no succession to be spoken of, then that person automatically became a counterfeit. We see this used very strongly in Irenaeus against heresies, as he combats the Gnostics. The Gnostics did not possess apostolic succession. They did not possess that laying on of hands and that succession from apostle to bishop to bishop. So therefore, their teaching is not apostolic, it's invented. Thirdly, as I just said, apostolic succession became the easiest way to spot a heretic or a counterfeit. Again, all you have to do is say, "Prove your succession," and they would be unable to do so. And therefore, they would be outed as the heretic that they were. Let's stop here, because this is going to be kind of a long discourse on the patristics. We'll pick up in part 2 in just a minute, just to split this in two so it's not quite so long. So we'll be back in just a moment. Bye.